So what I kind of wanted to talk about today is just a little bit about brain anatomy and how the brain is involved in our memory systems. And then we'll get into issues dealing with retrieval and retrieving back memories that we had from our past. But I think having an understanding of these different brain structures is an important component before we move on, okay? So if you remember from our conversation last Thursday, is we talked about episodic memories versus implicit memories versus explicit memories. And remember, explicit memories are those things that much like what we do, learning how to ride a bike, learning how to solve a math problem. Implicit memories we really didn't get into, but they're more of automatic memories. So things that don't require us to actually consciously recall something in order for us to do. And then episodic memories are memories for life events. So remembering our birthdays, what we need to do today, what we need to do tomorrow in kind of a timeline version, okay? We also have something, and we really didn't discuss it because it's actually connected with both, is we have what are called emotional memories, okay? Emotional memories are memories that are associated with either an episodic, explicit, or implicit memory, okay? It really is that kind of, this is how I reacted to this situation in the past, and then it gives you the information saying this made us happy in the past, this made us sad in the past, it allows us to have an understanding on an emotional level how we should be reacting based on that memory recall or that situation that we're in, okay? And it is really important because we know that emotional memories are stronger than explicit or episodic or implicit memories, because the emotional tie there, if you notice, we have the amygdala, okay? And just behind it, we have the hippocampus, which deals with explicit memories. And just below it, we have the cerebellum. And then in the frontal lobe, we do have this episodic memory that requires, again, conscious understanding. But the way this system works and a way to think about this is when we're receiving sensory information, the first place that it's processed is in this region right here. That's going to tie our emotional memories, our explicit memories from the hippocampus, and it's going to prepare us for action, okay? So what it does is it prepares us for action, okay? After that, because remember, sometimes it takes us a little bit longer if we need to think about how to react to something. It might be too late, okay? And this is happening on an unconscious level, all right? And then what happens in the next phase of recall and use of memory systems is this information that is preparing us to act then goes to the frontal lobe, goes to the temporal lobe, or it goes to the cerebellum, okay? And usually always to the cerebellum because that's going to start the coordination. Remember, the cerebellum has to do with coordinated movement. So it's going to get us ready for speak, writing. It's going to get us ready for balance, to run and coordinate our legs or our arms. So it usually always information is sent here to prepare us for those automatic behaviors that we need to react, okay? And then what happens is in the frontal lobe, we process this information. So we have that sensory information, these memories are tied to it, and then it's sent to our frontal lobe or our temporal lobe for evaluation, okay? And maybe the best way to think about this is what happens, okay, is so we are automatically prepared to act based on past memories and emotions. It's sent to the frontal lobe, And the frontal lobe is kind of the decision making once it gets to that conscious level to say, act accordingly or don't act, okay? So the behavior is broken, all right? Probably the best example of this, and I'm willing to bet everybody in the room has thought about this at least once or twice in your life, is wanting to slap someone or punch someone across the face, okay? Just either out of aggression, or maybe it's just one of those people you don't like, okay? That is this area of the brain. And then usually what happens is it's saying we're prepared to slap this person. And the frontal lobe goes with episodic memories, probably remembering that's not a good idea, that usually gets me in trouble, or it does. And so it sends an inhibitory response to the amygdala and to the hippocampus saying, execute that behavior. And consciously we go, wow, we didn't hit him because it would have negative consequences. Everyone's watching. I'd hurt myself, blah, blah, blah. But really we sent a neural impulse to our amygdala and our hippocampus saying, inhibit that action, okay? Now, there is a certain population of individuals who do not have this neural pathway that we have found. They do have the pathway that goes to the frontal lobe, but the inhibitory response is not there, okay? And we find that this inhibitory track is missing in people who are, for example, psychopathic serial killers, okay? We find that either on dissection of their brain or through brain imagery techniques, that this track that inhibits the amygdala and the hippocampus from acting is not present, okay? And so these individuals act very impulsively. They act as if they're reacting to emotion, not actual conscious thought. And it's also what allows them to feel like they can take advantage of other people, hurt them. It's why a serial killer can dissect someone without having any emotion or feeling behind it, and those types of things. So there is a certain population where this tract is missing, and we tend to find it in those individuals who are both psychopathic and engage in serial killing. So that's an example of what happens when this inhibitory process is not present, okay? So let's talk about things like retrieval, okay? And so when we talk about retrieval, we're talking about things such as how do we retrieve information? And this first one is how do we retrieve it purposely, on purpose, okay? And some things that we should note is there is what's called a serial positioning effect, okay? So primacy is more space is working memory to elaborately rehearse during encoding. That's primacy. And recency effect is items still in working memory, okay? And what we have found when we're looking at retrieval and retrieval issues is basically this, that we will retrieve the most similar recent past memory to make a decision on what we need to do right now, okay? So for example, and this occurs especially when we become more and more stressed. So for example, let's say you want to remember, you know, what happened when you visited your parents last, and it's stressing you out. Well, you probably will use your most recent memories, but not any of the other memories that are in the past, especially when your stress level is getting higher and higher and higher. So what this does is it makes it so we don't really can make a fair judgment in whether we should, for example, go visit mom and dad or not, okay? And so the other part of serial positioning effect is a tendency to recall items at the beginning and the end of a list. readily than those in the middle. So this is another aspect of this. And this is my next, you'll notice that as we've been doing these series of lectures, I've been giving study advice. This is why it's not always good to start at page 1 and read to page 20. Okay. So in the first run, maybe you do that. Okay. But a recommendation would be especially to get rid of serial position effect and what's called place effect, okay? Meaning that we tend to only recall information in a similar environment than when we learned it, okay? Is that on the first run, read page 1 to 20, the second run, 15 to 20, third one, 7 to 12. And mix up where you start in reading that chapter while you're reading it. Don't always, when studying, especially for exam, especially when you're cramming, it's because of the stress level that is increased. Reading from beginning to end means that you'll probably only remember what you read at the beginning of the chapter and at the end of the chapter when it comes to that exam that you were cramming for, as an example. The other advice is, and I don't know if this is on the next slide or next slide, no, is that there's also what's called positioning effect, okay? Meaning that we tend to recall information better when it's in the same situation as we learned it, okay? So again, when you're going to take an exam, it's best that you study that information in different locations. So maybe you go study it in the library, maybe you go study it in your apartment or dorm room, maybe you go study it outside, maybe you go study it, at the coffee shop. But studying information in multiple places will make it harder for that place effect to take place, okay? On the extreme level, if you're really cramming for a test, go see if you can go study in a classroom, because that's going to be the same environment that you have to take that exam. And it's much better to do it in that environment than, say, even the library or your apartment or dorm room. Okay. So keep those two kind of things in mind, especially when you're having increased stress or you're in a situation where you're cramming, and keep those things in mind. And again, earlier when we were looking at the brain, we kind of elaborated on the different types of memory. So this is an example of explicit autobiography memory, which is lifetime period, remnants, bumps, event-specific information. That's what I was talking about with the studying in a single place. Emotional memories don't necessarily have to include what you would really think as a memory. It can just be an extreme emotional reaction, okay? And there's some examples of these types of memories that are usually completely emotionally based, and I'm going to explain that in a minute. One is a flashbulb memory. A flashbulb memory is when someone triggers an event from your past that was highly emotional, and it's like you're almost there reliving it for just a brief few minutes, okay? Now, why are these called emotional memories? It's because we've really found that they're not actually accurate autobiographical memories, okay? And I think I provided this example in the past. For example, we've gone back and asked where people were during 9/11 when they heard the planes crash into the buildings. And we heard things like, I was watching the World Series when it happened and my wife came in the room and told me. Issue with that being the World Series wasn't on at that time, especially the World Series that he remembered watching, okay? And we find that when emotional events, for example, your team winning the World Series and 9/11 occurring, and they being two highly emotional events that occurred in a similar period of time, they tend to get blended together. They tend to move closer together into one emotional memory. And we have found that with, for example, flashbulb memories, they tend to be more emotionally accurate than they are recall accurate, okay? We also know that people who experience heavy trauma tend to can react emotionally and not understand why. Probably an extreme version of this is people who have, for example, borderline personality disorder. It's a disorder where early childhood traumas are swept under the rug and never discussed by the family. And so when certain events in the person's life comes up, they tend to have an extreme emotional reaction to it that then can lead to high risk behaviors such as going on a bender, extreme partying, extreme sex acts, those types of things, and the person spirals. Okay, again, the person can't say this is why I reacted in that situation. And this is an important aspect of the difference between autobiographical memories and emotional memories. A lot of individuals who have a trauma response or an extreme stress response to a situation don't always have a cognitive memory of that event occurring, okay? Then there's the issue of repressed memories. And this is something called motivated forgetting. And it has been a very controversial topic in the field of psychology and even in the field of neuroscience, because if you look at it from a scientific basis, okay, and again, science doesn't know everything, and an important point to make, science doesn't know everything. If you look at it from a scientific perspective, it's impossible to forget a memory. Okay, to purposely forget, I should put that out there, to purposely forget a memory. And the analogy that usually is used in textbooks and like is the pink elephant. Okay, so we were in this live classroom together. We could maybe do it with hand raising and stuff too. If I had you picture a pink elephant in your brain, okay, and it could be a stuffed pink elephant, it could be a live pink, it could be a flying pink elephant, just a pink elephant. And then if I asked you to tell me when you purposely forget about that pink elephant, and so maybe someone raises their hand and says, I forgot the pink elephant. The moment you say you forgot the pink elephant, you're remembering the pink elephant. And you're remembering that you purposely forgot the pink elephant, okay? So when it comes to issues of repressed memory, at least from a scientific perspective, is there evidence for purposeful repressed memories? No. Is there a mechanism, though, for non-purposed repressed memories? So memories people forgot that they didn't know they forgot. Yes. Okay, and the example, it really has to do with our neural basis, okay, is that when someone who has experienced extreme trauma, okay, trauma that maybe no one should experience, the brain does have natural mechanisms within the amygdala and the hippocampus that can block that memory from being consciously recalled until the individual feels that it is safe, or I don't mean to humanize or anthropomorphize the brain system, but when the brain feels like you're at a safe state, it then can make you consciously aware of that memory, okay? An example is when I worked with, I never had this with males, but with females who were sexually abused. and raped. Okay, when I mean raped, it was done in a violent, very aggressive way, usually by an acquaintance or a stranger or someone. Okay, and that kind of level of sexual violation. Okay, so usually what I would do is I'd work with the individual, help them get stabilized and everything, but I always marked on my calendar to follow up with them at 9 months post their event. Okay. And the reason why I did that is because usually around 9 months, the individual, hopefully the offender is being taken away somewhere. They've stabilized their life back out somewhat. They're working on recovering from the situation. And so the amygdala and the hippocampus says, okay, you're safe, and boom, all of these memories of that event start flooding back. And so what I usually found around 9 months is I would usually call them and say, how are you doing? And they'd be like, oh, I'm having nightmares. I'm having flashbulb memories. I'm having trauma response. And then it's time to bring them back in, because now that those memories are emotionally being released to the individual, it's time to come back in and work on those types of situations. So, and again, now, I mentioned that the debate about purposefully repressed memories is still out. I don't know if it will take more technology or whatnot, but a lot of times when we talk about purposeful repressed memories, unfortunately, what happened in the 90s and early 2000s is therapists came up with questioning techniques that they thought were getting to memories that the individual repressed, purposely repressed. But what we found in later research is it actually seeded those memories in those individuals, at least the majority of them. And so what's happened over the last 10, 20 years is a different type of interview process that we use with these individuals. It's called forensic interviewing, where we have gotten a lot more accurate with actually being able to get to what actually happened to, especially with children through adults. So the science of actually working with individuals who do feel like that they had been abused or hurt, especially in childhood, is getting a lot more accurate. And so I think we might see some of the ideas behind purposeful repressed memories change over the next while, but the verdict is still out. Okay. And this, I think this just kind of mentions this, especially when we're dealing with child sexual abuse events. Are they recovered or are they discovered memories? Abuse that is under knowledge, victims' accuracy, loss of memory, abuse is possible. And so it is possible to falsely reconstruct memories. And so this is kind of where we're at now, is how do we, if an adult does suspect that they were abused, but they simply can't remember, how can we be more accurate in differentiating between what would be called a false reconstruction versus an accurate reconstruction of those memories? And we're still working on that as of right now. This notion of false memory I've mentioned brings up also the issues of eyewitness testimony. So we know that eyewitness testimony is not the most accurate type of testimony there is. We find that it often deals with things like distortion, because when people go through extreme trauma or trauma situations, certain parts of the event can get exaggerated in a memory system, which is actually a natural defense mechanism for the person, because what you're doing is you're saying that part of that event is important to me because maybe it was getting closer to my own harm or my own hurt. It got as we would say, too close to home. So your memory tends to distort that component to keep you safe in future situations. The unfortunate part about it is that it might distort the perception of who did what and how did they do it, what was said, language that was used, those types of things, okay? And a lot of the distortions are based on our own biases. So if the person has darker skin versus lighter skin, those types of things, language, all of those things tend to get distorted in the situation to where it can lead to an inaccurate identification of the person that was there, okay? And that's our biggest concern with eyewitness testimonies, is the distortions tend to also be based on the person's bias, but also what the person thinks they need to do to keep themselves safe. I think we went over these. Hold on. Okay. Trying to get through a couple of these. So I do want to just kind of give some study skills so that we can continue on with our conversation. So what are some studies? If I were to summarize what we've been talking about, is one, give undivided attention to what you're working on, process the information deeply, make associations with knowledge you already know about. Try to make those associational hooks, create stories about it, use imagery when you can, try to imagine what's happening when you're reading your psych book or your math book or whatever you're doing. Encode early and often, so the sooner you start and the more often you work on these things, the stronger the memory will be. Other things that really help with retrieval is make sure you rewrite your notes. This was one of my #1 study skills back in college. I actually did two things that was my thing, and I'll just put it out there. One, I would rewrite all my notes, and then the other thing is I would act out, in a way, act out either in my head or if no one was around, I would act out the lecture that was given to us that day, okay? Talk to others, test yourself, ask yourself questions. And the other one is make sure you rest and eat well. Nutrition and getting good rest. Remember, memories are encoded when you're asleep and when you're in a restful state. And so staying up for an all-night bender in order to take a test the next day really isn't the best way to make sure that information gets retained easily. I'm going to skip this one for just a minute. Okay. All right, so those are our memory systems and how our memory systems work. And now what I want to talk about next is reasoning and decision making. What we've been talking about is the utilization of memories in order to inform us about the actions that we should make, about the decisions we should make. So we're going to spend some time now looking at, so you have the stimuli in front of you, what you're faced with. You have the emotional memories, you have the autobiography memories, you have maybe the explicit memories there. Now it's time to start making a decision about how to act or behave in a given situation, okay? Humans have two types of response systems. And they're simply called System 1 and System 2. System 2 is our rapid response system. It's actually what we're prepared to do in any given moment, given the situation. okay? System 2 is when we have to make a slow, effortful, analytical decision, okay? Now, we engage in system 1 most of the time because it doesn't require a lot of energy. It doesn't require a lot of processing, okay? Humans are really, really resistant to making slow effort analytical decisions in most situations because it takes a lot, it's exhausting. I think all of you know when you're studying for a test and you're studying and trying to make an effortful, it's exhausting, okay? So most of the time we rely on this system 1, which has 2 bases to it. One, it uses intuition, which is emotional memories. It's implicit memories that are saying this is what we should do. Or it uses something we call heuristics, which are mental shortcuts. It's kind of like an automatic process, okay? And some of these heuristics can lead us to a biased behavior or kind of a illogical system. Now, I want to make this very clear, and it's important to state this. Most of the time, heuristics and intuition get us through life, okay? Most of the time, it tells us who we should interact with, who we shouldn't interact with, how we should state something, how we shouldn't. Most of the time, it works really, really well. When this system 1 starts to break down is when we become more and more and more stressed, okay? I don't know about all of you. I know that when I get heavily stressed, I start to say dumb things unless I rely on my system 2 and try to slow down and take effortful control over my stress and the thing. If I just go with it, I start doing and saying really stupid things, okay? And so most of the time the system works really good. It starts to break down when we start getting more and more stressed, okay? And really the biases that we tend to start to make, especially when stress goes up, are these biases right here, okay? The first one is a confirmation bias, okay? And this is when we search only for information that supports our idea, okay? If anybody has ever been in an argument with someone who has a different political or religious view, or a different view about drug use and whatnot, this tends to be the biggest barrier, is the confirmation bias, especially when the conversation gets more and more intense, is that we tend to only start to hear, see, and sense things that support our own idea, our own belief system. And we completely ignore any counter information that would be against our belief or our attitude, okay? And when we have tested this, this can happen on a very conscious level, where a person purposely says, I'm not listening to you, I don't hear you, I don't see this. Or it can very much happen on an unconscious level. Usually we find this out when we test somebody after they've been through something kind of intense, someone who doesn't have their same belief system, and we have them do a recall test about, did you recall this person stating this? And the person has absolutely no recall of what that person said because it's a counter belief to that individual. Especially when we get stressed, we also have what's called a hindsight bias. This is when we report falsely that we predicted an outcome, that, hey, I always knew it was going to end up like this all along because X, Y, Z, okay? Availability heuristic is when we predict the probability of an outcome based on what's easily there to recall. So any information that is easily, rapidly there, we will make a judgment upon, okay? And again, when we become more and more stressed, the more likely we'll use these heuristics falsely, okay? Base rate fallacy is the use of what we think the population is like based on our experience, okay? So for example, a good example is the fallacy in the United States, for example, that that Black individuals are criminal because of our view of what happens in the prison system, that we see, you know, that Black men and stuff are arrested more often, and they're put in prison more often, and therefore those individuals must be more criminal-like. Okay, this is what's called a base rate fallacy, because when we look at the population distribution, it doesn't necessarily work out based upon reactions of the criminal justice system, okay? And so this is what's called a base rate fallacy. A representative heuristic is when we make a judgment purely based on our stereotypes of a given group or a given situation, okay? So this is going into a situation where people are different from you, which increases your stress. So you're more likely to use your stereotype about those individuals rather than seeing those individuals more on an individual level, okay? And so these are the issues that can go wrong with our system one. As I said, when we're not stressed and the stress level isn't increasing, system one works really well. It's when we start increasing stress that we start introducing these biases and these heuristics and these fallacies. And that's when our judgment is more likely to be biased, and we're more likely to make the wrong decision based on analyzing things with system one, our rapid decision-making system, okay? The other thing that we should note, and this is kind of an interesting association between emotions and cognition. So we know that mood influences the way we think. It just may not be the way that we think it is, because we've actually found that when people are in a bad mood, they're more likely to carefully use logic to solve a problem. So we actually become more rational as our mood is decreased, okay? However, when we're in more of a good mood, one, our decision-making process becomes more efficient, and this is where we get more original and creative thinking, and we're more likely to ignore irrelevant information. So this is kind of the good and the bad of mood. When we're in a bad mood, we're more likely to analyze every little tiny aspect of a problem. When we're in a good mood, we actually have the resources to do that in an efficient and effective way, okay? So just kind of an interesting way to see when, you know, the difference between being in bad, good mood. Yes, we're not as analytical when we're in a good mood, but when we are in a good mood, that we actually have the resources to be analytical, as I guess the conclusion to that situation. Okay. All right. So the thing that I want to talk about next, just kind of going on with our conversation, is the concept of intelligence, okay? And what is intelligence? What is it about, and how does it influence our ideas about culture, about people and society? Okay, so I'm going to give kind of a quick definition of intelligence as we start this conversation. Intelligence is where you should be psychologically and cognitively at a given age. Okay, and we actually have what's called an intelligent quotient. Okay, which is basically your psychological age divided by your chronological age. Okay, and what has happened over the years is that a bunch of tests have been developed and tested over and over and over to try and get at this idea of what is your intelligence quotient, okay, which is again chronic age and versus psychological age. And if they match, you get a score of 1. All right. If your intelligence level or your IQ score is above your chronological age, you score above a 1. If your intelligence age or your intelligence quotient is below your chronological age, you score under A1. Okay, so that's kind of how an intelligence score works. All right, and one of the very first ones, at least here in the United States, was what's called the Pearson's G. And the thing that we've always wanted to do with intelligence tests is to make sure that they're valid, reliable, and standardized, so that no matter who is taking it, it will measure what it says it's going to measure. Okay, it will do it reliably over time, and that whoever is administering it will administer it the same to a 3-year-old in New York City to a 3-year-old in California. Okay, because the hope is to take out bias in the measure. And so we will need to look at this as we move forward about our intelligence tests really valid, reliable, and standardized. Okay. So again, if the criteria for an intelligence test is it valid, does it test, measure what it purports to measure? So for example, is your intelligence score predictive of things like your GPA, your school performance, those types of things, because that's originally what intelligence was trying to measure, is really academic performance. And so is measures of our intelligence tests predictive of that? Reliability is, does a test performance, is it consistent? So if you give a child an intelligence test at time 1, will they score the same in time 3 with that measure if it's a short period of time? Okay, and then standardized is the measure uniform in how it's administered? Is again a child in New York versus a child in California, is it administered exactly the same, so there isn't any potential bias in the scores between those two children? Okay. And there's some things that we should talk about. So like I said, Binet was the original one to come up with a test, and he came up with something called the mental age. Sternberg came along and he developed the intelligence quotient, which is your mental age. I think, let's see, it's your chronological age divided by your mental age. And this gives us what we call a normal distribution. And this then combined to give us what's called the Stanford Binet test. You can read a little bit more about this if you're interested in your textbook. Okay. And this is the normal distribution. Okay. Again, remember when I used the word 1, okay, basically what you do is you take the individual score and you multiply it by 100. So it happens on an interval of 15. So we have 100 as the average. and then it deviates by about 15, all right? And that makes it so that we know that within one deviation of the mean or the average, this represents about 68% of individuals. So 68% of individuals score between an 84 and a 116, okay? But we can also put, say, let someone who scores someone at 116, we know that that means that they scored above 84%, or they're in the 84th percentile of individuals within that distribution, okay? And then we can see it increases by 132, 148, okay? And as we decrease here, this is how this usually worked. Now, originally, I'm going to use what are considered derogatory terms. So I want everybody to know this, that at this moment in our modern times, these are derogatory terms, but what I want everyone to realize is these were once very technical terms, okay? And so usually what we found is that people, when we start getting to 84 to 68, originally the term was called moron. This is someone who would be considered moronic, okay? And anyone who scored usually below a 68 would be considered retarded or mentally retarded, okay? And that's really where those terms came up from, is the terminology that they give individuals, used to give individuals based on the score that they scored on a standardized intelligence test, okay? And then of course here, you get very smart people, and then you get up here and you get into the genius categories. And, you know, there's people who state, even though they never took the test, that these are the Einsteins of the world who scored above 148 or 160. But I will tell you that they never took IQ tests. Our current to past president never actually took an intelligence test, even though he claims that his IQ is above 130 or 160. But those are kind of just some things to kind of keep in mind, is really these individuals are quite rare, okay? So the question becomes, are these tests accurate? Do they have a cultural bias? What is the genetics of intelligence? And what are the environmental influences on these types of things, okay? So I'm going to start with these different views. So are intelligence tests culturally biased? The answer is most likely. Most intelligence tests are based on a Western educational view about where someone should be by a given mental age. So who should be reading when, how should you be reading when, and the like. And so we have found these to be are they culturally fair tests? Not necessarily. And I'm going to give some examples of this. Now, I am going to state this, and this is an important thing to say, is in a lot of the modern tests that we do today, we actually have scales that are based dependent upon where you are culturally. So, for example, there's scales that will score for different populations. And so that's one way they've tried to balance this out, okay? But let me give you a cultural bias example. And I really think these studies are fascinating. I can't draw an L very well, okay? But I'm going to bring up a series of studies that was done at Stanford University and University of California. And as we may want to recognize is that there's a bias between people who go to Stanford and UCLA versus people who ended up in the community colleges in inner city Los Angeles, okay? And that the majority of individuals at Stanford tended to be white, individuals who tended to be in the community college in the inner cities of Los Angeles tended to be Black. And so they wanted to do a series of studies of what is it that creates these biases between individuals there versus individuals who are in Stanford. And we wanted to look at cognition and the influence of individuals' presence, okay? So what they did is on a Saturday, they randomly took, meaning that they randomly selected some individuals who were willing to participate in this experiment from inner city community colleges in Los Angeles, okay? And they gave a cognitive test that was equivalent to a test of IQ. In fact, they're very much are correlated. They score the same, those types of things, okay? I think I actually can do this in one. Let me try it in one, okay? And of course, they started with testing their students there at Stanford. And of course, you know, what you'd expect because they're well acclimated and whatnot in this type of system, they scored fairly high in this cognitive test, okay? Which you would expect for individuals who are accepted to Stanford or to UCLA or places like that, okay? The interesting part was in group 1 and group 2, okay? Group 1 of the individuals that they took to the first, let's say the first Saturday at Stanford, is that in group 1, when the individuals walked in, there were white students standing around. They weren't interacting. They weren't giving any dirty looks. They were just there. All right. And in that first Saturday, those students scored what people would consider predictively low because these students weren't going to Stanford University, right? Or whatever you'd like to say. The interesting thing was actually in that second group that they had, because on another Saturday, they brought students there and there were no other students around. No other students. The only person there was a tester that collected the test. That was all that was there. And again, they administered these cognitive tests. And the interesting thing is those students from the inner city college scored the same. And in some cases, significantly higher than the Stanford University students, okay? So this goes to a couple points on this list. Cultural bias that then drives our behavior and drives the situation, and environmental influence. Who is there during the time of the testing? Who is there when the person is going through this cognitive task? Because when you have no, you know, feeling, this research is what's called stereotype threat research, in where we test people's performance in the presence of a potential stereotyping of that individual, okay? And what we find is when the ability to stereotype someone is taken away, they tend to score very well or equivalent to a control group of some type, okay? And so this gets to kind of cultural biases and environmental biases as far as that's concerned. Now, the next issue is genetics. Okay. When these tests were originally done, we were still in kind of this notion that there are superior people genetically. There, you know, we still had a aristocratic systems around the world, those types of things. I think we still do, where privilege is based on birth. okay? And intelligence was seen as something of privilege, okay? And we have had questions of what's known as heritability, all right? And the question is your intelligence fixed because of your genetics, or is it changeable based on experience, okay? And the conclusion is that heredity can set the boundaries, all right? So for example, if an individual is born with some type of genetic disorder that then results in influence into their psychological world, such as, things like Down syndrome as an example, even though there's very intelligent Down syndromes individuals, or other genetic disorders that then inhibit the upper level of someone's intelligence abilities, okay? Even in a non-disordered populations, we know that there's upper and lower limits to intelligence, okay? Anyways, but the idea is intelligence fixed? And the answer is the evidence suggests no, it's movable. Okay, so for example, you being here in university, you'll leave university on average 15 points higher on intelligence tests. So if you came into Grand Canyon at an IQ of 100, you're most likely going to leave Grand Canyon University when you graduate between 115 to 120. Okay. We know that with age, intelligence scores will increase. Okay. And the other issue is dependent upon a person's life experiences, how they approach testing also influences intelligence scores. And I gave that example a couple of weeks ago where we gave individuals with IQs of around 90 to 100, either a hard to read IQ test or an easy to read one. And the individuals who had to process that hard IQ test tended to score average or above, whereas the individuals who read the easy one did their predictable score. So there's also things that influence this issue. And so it's still much for debate. What we do know is there's genetics sets the lower and upper bounds of our intelligence, but it doesn't determine everything about the intelligence that we have. Okay. And this is just mentioning that Flynn effect that is kind of interesting, in that what we see with each successive generation, we're becoming more and more and more intelligent. Okay, and so this is an example. The average in 1932 was right here, and then we took the average in 1997 using the 1932 scoring procedure, and the average went up to 120. Okay, so literally, good news. If you want to, you can go home and tell mom and dad that by this Flynn effect that we would test everybody in, that you are of superior intellect when you compare yourself to, for example, Einstein or Newton. Theoretically, you would test much higher than what they tested back in the time when they would have taken an IQ test. But this is the Flynn effect, is we're seeing individuals becoming better and better at solving these tests on intelligence. Now, I did mention, again, when we look at giftedness, that we're usually looking at people with 130 or above. And then when we look at intellectual disability, we're usually looking at a score of 70 or below. And the question becomes, is a person with an IQ of 130 or above truly gifted, or not when compared to the general population. And this is of an interesting debate. Yes, we do see some savants out there that score really high on IQ tests that can do miraculous things with music, with mathematics, those types of things. But the interesting thing was research done by Terman, because what he believed, he was a strong advocate of the intelligence movement, of the IQ movement. And so he felt that the most socially well-adjusted and successful adults would score above a 130. And that the less you score, the less socially well-adjusted and the less successful you would be. So he followed people who were quote unquote scored in the gifted range for decades. We're talking 40, 50 years. He followed these individuals to, in his mind, prove that people who scored in the gifted range would be the leaders of the world, would be the grand people who are making all of these life changes in our world and those types of things. And what he found, to his own dismay, is no, it doesn't. That actually what he found in his research is people who are most successful in our world actually score between about a 95 to about a 110 IQ, meaning average. And that the further you got away from that, the less socially well-adjusted you became, the less successful you became as an adult. Many of the people that he had in the gifted ended up being very mediocre in life, and mediocre meaning that they tended to not go on and be leaders of organizations or do great innovations. They usually did, a lot of them did manual labor. They tended to do jobs that that are part of normal world, and not many of them made it to the heightened success that he predicted that they would. Okay, and so yes, in the gifted range, are there individuals who some of the times they're called savant, that have these incredible abilities. But for the most part, people who score in the gifted range actually, and some research has suggested, have about the same advantage of individuals who score below 70. They tend not to be much more successful than the individuals who are scoring in that range and below. Okay. And so again, we see these differences, and the research suggests that the reason why people who score average on an IQ test become successful is because they have the resources. They're not overwhelmed by their world because they're scoring too high or scoring too low on an intelligence test. They have sufficient number of resources to deal with the social demands of the world, to deal with success with individuals, because you got to remember, we live in a social world, not a cognitively isolated world. Okay. We've already talked about that. And then the other part that I do just want to mention is the movement in the intelligence reign, and we can end class with this discussion today, is to this idea of multiple intelligence. So usually what we measured, again, dealing with academics, was analytical ability. So analytical intelligence and those types of things. And we thought that that was the only type of intelligence. But then as we started moving forward, we also recognized that, there's a practical intelligence. You think about someone who is street smart, okay? This is someone who has practical intelligence. And we know that there's a creative intelligence. This is an individual who comes up with amazing ideas and is very creative in their problem-solving solution. And that has led to all types of different types of intelligence that we're looking at. So for example, Gardner came up with, there's a verbal, mathematical, there's a spatial, there's an someone who's a naturalist versus an existentialist, and there's music type of intelligence. And so where the field is right now on the idea of intelligence is that we know that there's much more to people's intelligence than just their analytical intelligence. We also have different other types of intelligence that aren't always really recognized by the standard testing procedures that we use with intelligence. One of the areas that I've been interested lately in is the study of emotional intelligence, which is the ability to be very self-aware of your own emotional state, having an awareness of someone else's emotional state, and being able to appropriately respond to them. That's called emotional intelligence. And we know that people vary on this measure. There's people who are incredibly self-aware, but have no awareness of others. And then there's people who have awareness of others, but very little awareness of themselves. And then we have individuals who have absolutely no self-awareness or awareness of others' emotional states. So that's another type of intelligence that we're looking at, because we're finding that one, it's a trainable type of intelligence, but we're also finding the more people have emotional intelligence, the more successful they tend to be. And so that right now, that's a large area of research as well in the field of intelligence. Okay. All right.